Today we're going to talk about the Canadian trucker protest, Tucker Carlson and other Republicans' involvement, and the insidious reason that the right is supporting it. And I interview Al Franken about whether he'd run again for office, how much the Democrats should focus on January 6th ahead of midterms, and how much messaging should be taken into consideration when Democrats run candidates. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're listening to No Lie. So I'm sure you've heard a little about the Canadian trucker protest, and if you watch Fox News, I'm sure you've heard a lot about the Canadian trucker protest. Basically, a faction of right-wing Canadian truckers who oppose Canada's vaccine mandates have used their semis to create roadblocks at a bunch of US-Canada border points, and that's in Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. In Ontario, the Ambassador Bridge alone is responsible for over 27% of trade between the US and Canada. That's the bridge that connects Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan. And so obviously, it's already having a huge impact on the auto industry, which has started cutting shifts because of a shortage of supplies. And those delays are costing as much as $300 million per day in economic damage. It's also serving as a model for protests, not only at other US-Canada border points, but around the world, where just a few truckers are basically holding an already fragile supply chain hostage to exact concessions on public health during a pandemic. Now, they're calling themselves the Freedom Convoy because of course they are. It's always the people who think they're entitled to some unmitigated, absolute degree of freedom, and that if they don't have their demands met, then they want to burn the whole place down. Like, you can live in a free country like the US or Canada. That doesn't mean that none of the rules apply to you. We have laws. You wear seatbelts in cars. You wear pants in public. You can't punch someone in the face. That doesn't mean you've lost your freedom. It means that you are part of a functional society, which doesn't seem to have gotten through to these quote-unquote patriots who are throwing temper tantrums because they're not getting their way. Their way being no safety measures in the middle of a global pandemic that's already killed 6 million people worldwide. But I should note that it's not all truckers who support this, nor is it even a majority of truckers. They're basically a fringe group that isn't even popular. In Canada, all of 17% strongly support what the Freedom Convoy is doing. Meanwhile, 2/3 of Canadians oppose them. And the vaccine rules and safety measures that they're protesting, those are unsurprisingly overwhelmingly popular in Canada. Even in Alberta, which is likely the most conservative province, elected officials have implemented vaccine passports, school mask mandates, and bans on private indoor gatherings of more than 10 people. Those are implemented by conservative lawmakers. Even the union that represents most of these long-haul truck drivers criticized the protest, arguing that these blockades aren't a safe or effective policy. And they're right, probably not gaining a ton of sympathy by destroying multinational supply chains. But I'll tell you who does support it, people like Tucker Carlson.
We want freedom, the truckers are saying, freedom from mandates. It's a very straightforward ask, but so far the truckers don't have that freedom, and so their blockade continues. So far, that blockade has forced the Ford Motor Company to shut down one of its manufacturing plants and to operate another plant with a skeleton crew. Toyota says it won't be able to manufacture vehicles in Ontario for the rest of the week. General Motors has canceled multiple shifts at its plant in Lansing, Michigan, due to part shortages. So this protest is less than a week old, and already it is causing deep pain to at least one global industry. It's hard to overstate the historical significance of what we're watching right here. The Canadian Trucker Convoy is the single most successful human rights protest in a generation. If nothing else, it has been a very useful reminder to our entitled ruling class that working class men can be pushed, but only so far. When they push back, it hurts. It turns out that truck drivers are more important to a country's future than, say, diversity consultants or even MSNBC contributors. Who knew? The White House has no interest in knowing. According to the Associated Press tonight, the Biden administration is, quote, urging the Trudeau government to, quote, use its federal powers to stop this protest, to end the truckers' protest. In other words, crush them by force. Politico is reporting that Biden officials are coordinating with Canadian authorities to, quote, establish alternate traffic routes around the protesters. That's Scranton Joe, the pro-union guy, shutting down a labor action.
And there is a reason that the far right and people like Tucker Carlson are such big fans of this protest. It's because it encompasses two things that help them politically. One is opposition to vaccine mandates, which of course we are all well aware of, and the other is that it's adding further strain to a supply chain that's already been tested by this pandemic, meaning that Republicans get to continue wailing about high prices and inflation. And yet when Republicans are asked about solutions to these problems, again, that they fall over themselves complaining about, well, then they're just not interested. Think about it. What is the solution to COVID? Getting everyone vaccinated. That's it. That's the solution. COVID won't disappear until enough people are vaccinated. But most vaccine skeptical people are the Republicans. And so, in effect, the people complaining about COVID are the same ones helping prolong it. No solutions. What about inflation and high prices? Okay, well, Democrats introduced the America Competes Act, which helps fund the domestic semiconductor chip industry, which would ease one of the worst drivers of inflation. Every Republican but one, Adam Kinzinger, voted against it. Democrats introduced Build Back Better, which 17 Nobel Prize-winning economists said would ease longer-term inflationary pressures. Every Republican voted against that. And now you have this Canadian trucker protest, which is already threatening to drive up the cost of goods and shuttering auto factories, which, by the way, are the #1 driver of inflation in this country. And what are Republicans doing? They are cheering it on. Tucker, Ron DeSantis, Ken Paxton, Republican House, Senate, gubernatorial candidates, they will wail about how bad it is that prices are going up, and yet when there is an obvious, visible example of something that will directly cause prices to rise, they cheer it on. And so maybe, and I'm just spitballing here, maybe Republicans and Fox News want as much inflation as possible and to block any efforts to ease it because high inflation and high prices gives them something to complain about on an endless loop. Because that's what they do. They don't care what needs to be destroyed so long as they can exploit it for their own personal gain. They don't want to govern. They don't want to fix anything. They don't want to make their constituents' lives better. They just want to rule. That's why they're here. Look at Greg Abbott. 700 Texans died in the last cold front. 5 million left without power. And instead of fixing it in Texas, they spent their political capital passing a voter suppression law, SB 1. SB 1, the top priority, in the same way that HR 1 was the congressional Democrats' top priority. Their top priority in Texas was entrenching their own power and not even bothering to pass a real bill reforming the power grid. They opted instead for some bill with a loophole that allowed natural gas companies to simply opt out. So look, if Republicans want to complain, that's fine. I get it. That's their prerogative. They're the party out of power. But once you start blocking the solutions, once you actively work to ensure that those problems won't get fixed, once you start cheering on the causes of those problems, then you've given the game away. So look for the people trying to fix things, not the ones trying to break them. To listen to my interview with Al Franken, where we talk about whether he'd run again for office, how much the Democrats should be focusing on January 6th ahead of midterms, and how much messaging should be taken into consideration when Democrats run candidates, click the thumbnail right here on this screen or check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel.